Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I hope everybody is safe. So I believe the previous speakers, Alvin and Thomas, has already touched a lot on the users, a lot on identities. And this brings me to the next topic, right, which is really identities and what goes behind identities, what goes behind identity theft, right? So first thing, let's take a look at the workforce today and the dynamics of those workforce. Um, of course, the first thing you have is something called a gig economy or gig workers. How many of you are familiar with this term? Just a raise of hand? Yeah, I do see some head of nods. So for those of you who are not familiar, we are at a stage where skilled resources are far and few, and we need to engage skilled resources as best as we can, right? On a temporary basis, sometimes even on a project basis. Think about it as you know, for example, Grab. I took a Grab here today. The Grab driver that I was speaking to is a freelancer, not necessarily an employee of Grab, but you know, he happens to operate under the Grab platform as a driver, right? So again, in most of the organizations today, we are engaging a lot of these skilled resources on a temporary basis and giving them accesses to the corporate resources. So that definitely changes the dynamics of how we want to protect and how we allow these people to access the environments, right? The next thing we talked about, and Thomas and Alvin also spoke about this, is about leveraging the digital technologies that we have today. You know, 2 years into the pandemic, many of the businesses have been forced to transform, have brought their businesses online, not necessarily adopting all of the cloud technologies. We know that some of these technologies that you use today within your organizations as SMEs can never be a cloud platform, right? Let's be real, right? You're not gonna move your production lines into the cloud. That can never happen, right? Your production lines are always gonna stay on premise. So how do you then bridge that gap between adopting cloud technologies as well as protecting those technologies that you have on premise today, right? That becomes an issue. And of course, the last part is around globalization. So as an organization today, I know, and many of you would know, that we can never operate alone in this world as we live today. A lot of the suppliers that we work with, a lot of the customers that we work with are global in nature, right? And with this hyper connectivity, how do we ensure that we are being protected across the board, across our supply chains, across our supply lines, across our customers, keeping them safe, across our contractors, keeping them safe? And on top of that, it's not necessarily that the regulators are being any easier on us. The regulators are enforcing more controls, are requiring us as organizations to adopt more best practices. So these are some of these dynamics that has been happening over the last 2 years. And I'll talk a little bit more as we go on, right? So let's examine the nature of the workforce itself. And some of you would already have experienced this in your organizations, but some of you may not, right? So I call it the 5 phases of the workforce risk. And let's talk about the first one, which is really around the careless worker, right? So nothing new. You know, Thomas talked about people writing down passwords. I remember once upon a time when we still could go into the office, people would actually write their passwords down on post-it pads, paste it on the computer monitor, right? And that's their login credentials. You know, so careless workers. But what's more prevalent is people are going into internet cafes, working from cafes, using the public Wi-Fi's, accessing corporate data, right? Either through VPN, not through VPN, through the SaaS applications, whatever it may be. That brings tremendous risk to organizations, right? And we can talk about that in further detail. The next one is around disgruntled employees. A couple of years ago, Tesla had a process technician that was very unhappy with his job, so the rumor was that he was unhappy with his job. Some say he was mentally ill, but whatever the case, he took the process of the battery manufacturing and exposed it out to the public, right? What does that mean for Tesla? It really meant that they lost tremendous IP and tremendous revenue simply because the battery was the biggest thing that Tesla had going for them at that point of time, right? So again, disgruntled employees, you can never say that you never have one. It's always to be on the lookout for one, right? Malicious imposters, I believe the previous speakers have spoken about that, and I shall not go a lot deeper, but essentially it's when credentials has been breached, the cyber attackers would then take those credentials and then go into the organization imposting as that particular employee or even as your third-party supplier, right? Many years ago, I remember a story that we had of a customer of mine. They were on a big recruitment hunt and they were engaged with a recruitment agency. And many people would not have expected that a recruitment agency were to get breached, right? So the recruitment agency got breached, but the ultimate aim was that particular organization that they were serving, because that was the crown jewels that they were after. So they posed as the recruitment agency, sent out resume with embedded malwares, and guess what? People tend to open that email, right? Because it's from a recruitment agency, it's a legitimate agency that they work with, and they were on a recruitment drive. So again, malicious imposters, and I touched a lot about the third party, the end party, the story about the recruitment agency. So again, we are so dependent on our third parties, we are so dependent on the suppliers, that today, we're so hyper-connected with them that we cannot not interact with them, right? So you are only as good as your weakest line of defense. And sometimes that, unfortunately, takes you to your fourth party, your fifth party, right? Last but not least, this is something called the double agent. And while many organizations don't like to admit this, but we have seen cyber espionage of competing companies stealing other competing technologies, so to gain an advantage or to gain IP. It happens. It still do happen. People get employed. Contractors get employed to impersonate, to breach a particular organization, to be a janitor, to be an aircon technician, so that they can get access to the environment and do the necessary things that they need to do as a cyber espionage, right? So by tapping into your wiring systems, by tapping into aircon and heating and ventilation systems, yes, there is a possibility that they can get to your systems as well, right? So moving on, in summary, what has the pandemic done to us? It really just have accelerated the risk exposure that we are all exposed to today, right? I shall not talk about the digital and cloud transformation because I believe that's covered, so well covered. But the one trend that we are seeing, at which many organizations have started realizing, is that it's never a 1 or 0 game. It's never a cloud or on-prem game. Today, many of the organizations are trying to adopt a hybrid approach, right? And that is a struggle because not all solutions are built to support a hybrid approach. The newer solutions are built to support the cloud only, or some of the other traditional legacy solutions are built to support the on-prem only. So how do you bridge that gap, right? The next thing is around the increased growing, the attack surface. So Thomas has covered that at length. I shall not go into that, so thank you, Thomas, for covering part of the topic. But as we all telecommute, as we all work from home, we have heard instances of, people jumping into Zoom sessions where they weren't even supposed to be there, right? How does that happen, right? Again, because today we are honestly, most of us today, when we access corporate resources, I use 3 devices at least to access corporate resources. Most of you will at least have 2, right? Mobile phones and your laptops. So that's 2. If you increase the third factor, which is your tablets, that's 3. You go onto public Wi-Fi, that's 4, right? You use anything else outside, that's 5th and the 6th. So it just increases. And it just gives the attackers a lot more opportunity to social media you, to try and exploit those vulnerabilities and gain access to credentials. So that's what's truly happening, right? And then last but not least, I talk about the regulatory and the compliances, right? The regulators are not letting up because the cyber breaches are becoming more prevalent. The regulators just have to do something about it, right? MAS, when was it? About a year and a half ago, released the new MAS TRM, the Technology Risk Management, and it even went down to the extent to, say your third party and your fourth party need to be cyber secure. Why I know about this? Because a small medical healthcare provider came to me and said, Charles, a particular bank has just asked me to comply to MAS TRM. Why? Because I'm their third party, I'm their fourth party service provider. I hold their employee credentials, I hold their employee information and data, right? So the regulators are definitely not letting up. This is the other myth that a lot of people carry with them to say, hey, you know what, Charles, I think we are good, we are protected because all my employees in the organization have passwords. They really truly have passwords, and their passwords are 10 characters long. Fantastic, great, right? But password protected, really? And even with the largest organizations in the world, this is based on the Verizon Breach report that was released last year. 81% of all cyber attacks is because of either weak credentials or stolen credentials, right? The next thing about passwords, while it says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is the most common password, I can tell you in Singapore, the most common password is password. The most common password is password, right? No matter how you spell it, with a capital P and then with a capital D at the end, it's still password, right? Some people use their birth dates. Some people use their pet's name. I know everybody is at home watching YouTube videos right now, especially if you're on Zoom as well, you probably have quicker access to it. Go into a YouTube video, I believe it was a Saturday Night Live talk show, right? It was in the US, and they went to the streets to ask people around their passwords. When they interviewed individuals, and when it got to the 4th question, people would naturally give out their passwords. You'll be surprised. Social engineering, right? Just by asking questions. Go search that YouTube video. I think it is a great user awareness program because people would really, it really will resonate to them, right? That people commonly will use the things. And the reason why people do that is because on average, and the research that we did showed that 21, people, an individual like myself would at least need to remember 21 passwords. 21 passwords. And this changes every 90 days. So imagine how does that do for your employees, especially with people that are not that tech savvy, right? It's going to be ridiculous for them. So the easiest way is to reuse all the passwords to be the same. And what happens with that is, fine, the cyber attacker will breach one credential, and he will use that same password across the board, across all the other applications that he has access to, right? Last but not least, is also about user productivity. And when we did the research back then, this was about 1.5 years ago, prior to the pandemic. Call desk was receiving about 40% of the time password resets, right? So imagine your IT staff that you have in your organization. Thomas talked about hire one IT person. Can you imagine if the one IT person every day has to just do password resets, right? That's going to be crazy. Right? So these are just some statistics and trends for you all to be aware of, because these are very important when you formulate a strategy in terms of protecting your credentials and your identity. So let's talk about what are critical today. I won't talk so much about the things on the left, because I think the things on the left has been most commonly talked about. The things on the right is what people are today concerned about, especially 2 years into the pandemic, where we know that a default working from home strategy is going to stay, right? Or at least 50% of the workforce has to work from home. The first thing that most people would want to know, and people are trying to ascertain, is are the employees or are the people that is accessing the systems or your corporate systems are who they say they are, right? Is Charles accessing the RSA systems Charles? Is he truly Charles? I can't see Charles on the other side of the computer, right? I don't have him turn on the computer all the time, every time he needs to access it, right? So again, how do I assure myself that that's Charles? And again, Charles has spent 10 years in RSA and moved across multiple roles. Suddenly, Charles becomes a super user because now he came from finance, he has done sales, he has done marketing. Now Charles has access to 90% of the systems. Is he overprivileged, right? Should his access to some of the systems be revoked? How do you ensure, how do you monitor an employee that has overprivileged accesses, right? Because that poses a big risk. Because if an employee has overprivileged accesses, meaning that every time he gets breached, or should he get breached, it also means that 90% of the resources will get breached, right? Last but not least, we talked about and I think you have heard a lot in the marketplace, about zero trust, right? All I can say is zero trust is not a product, right? Zero trust is a strategy. It's a model that you adopt. It's a framework that you can adopt, but it's not a product. It comprises of multiple different processes, policies, as well as, of course, cyber solutions that you put in place. And effectively, what zero trust means, in layman terms, very simply, is trust nothing that's coming in. That's essentially what it is. So imagine how the olden days where they built castles, right? And every time when they build a castle, they will always strategize to say, okay, if the enemy were to enter from the front gate, right, I will set traps. I will try and block him off, right, so that he doesn't penetrate it further, right? If the enemy were to enter from the back gate, right, what do I do? How do I trap him there, right? Zero trust is exactly that, right? If the cyber attacker were to come into an environment, how do you stop him at the gate? How do you stop him from penetrating further? That is truly a zero trust strategy or zero trust model, right? Okay, so I know Alvin in his earlier slide talked about the parameter. I'm not gonna, so thank you, Alvin, for doing that. I'm not going to talk too much about the parameter today. I think most of us would already be very familiar with it. That's the on-prem environment, which is really within your office premises, and then of course of some use of the cloud. And today, what has transformed is, what we say is parameterless. I want to put in the notion that it's not just parameterless for your organization, or for your company, or for your employees. It's also the people on the right, which is your customers, which is also your contractors and subcontractors, right? Because you are not only accessing the corporate resources, or they are not only accessing your corporate resources, but they're also accessing some form of cloud services, right? Be it whether is it your employees, be it whether is it your customers, or be it whether is it your subcontractors, right? Given such a diverse environment like this, how then do you secure credentials? That's always going to be a big question, right? So I talked about the zero trust strategy, and I talked about the zero trust model. One of the ways, obviously, it's through the identity and access, right? By putting identity and access as central to your zero trust strategy, it's not the only strategy, it's one of the many policies and one of the many things that you do. It's really to challenge the accesses from multiple ends, right? That means, be it whether it's corporate employees coming in, be it whether it's on-prem, or be it whether it's cloud, have a central platform where identities are managed centrally across the board. So be it whether it's employees, subcontractors, or customers, right? Because you will find that in many situations today, that one breach will lead to the other, right? A breach from the customer end will lead to exploitation of corporate resources and vice versa, right? A breach of the employees or subcontractors will lead to customer data and information being exploited, right? So what you need truly, and I know, this may go against the norm, what truly it's really to have a central identity platform so that you can see end-to-end and you can monitor accesses and credentials that's going across and behaviors going across the multiple bidirectional, right? So step one, we talked about identity assurance, making sure, earlier on this morning, CSA spoke about multi-factor authentication. Again, multi-factor authentication is not a device, right? It's not an app. Multi-factor just means more than one factor. So should there be something wrong, should there be a suspicious behavior, it's to challenge you further, to challenge you to see whether are you who you say you are. Is Charles really the person that's trying to authenticate, right? It may be using biometrics, using fingerprint, using a token, using a mobile device, whatever it may be. It's just to validate and verify to make sure that Charles is Charles who is accessing the data and the environment. Right? So that's the step one. And don't worry about pulling this or taking pictures, because this is available on the RSA Secure ID website. We have a blog around the white papers around the best practices and steps to do in terms of securing identities, right? Next, we talked about overprivileged employees, and that's always going to pose a big risk. So in step two is to really improve governance. And when we say improve governance, is to really have a continuous ongoing basis and ongoing tracking of the users and what they have access to, right? I like to bring up a story of a situation that I had with a conversation that I had with a customer a couple of months back, right? Identities, unfortunately, and user access and authentication has always been the job of IT, unfortunately. But it should never be the job of IT. If you think about it, the people that knows their employees best or their staff best is their own managers, right? And who is IT to say Charles should not be granted the rights to application XYZ? It's not Charles. Charles doesn't know any better. I'm just administrating all the credentials if I'm IT, right? The people that should be attesting against those accesses should be the line of business and should be the managers that's responsible for the staff. And that's what identity governance is. Identity governance is to make sure that the line of business and that you have your operations manager in the plant ensuring that his technicians are granted the appropriate accesses and not overprivileged, right? IT is there to facilitate, not to administer. To facilitate, part of it is to help administer, but never to attest, right? So that's identity governance. And then last but not least, it's looking at insider threats, right? And today, there's so much data and so much information that you simply can't eyeball as a human being. Even you have that one IT staff that Thomas talked about in terms of where you go and employ, it's impossible for him to eyeball everybody's accesses and how are they accessing the environment. It's impossible, right? Technology is at a stage today where we have the ability to do analytics in the faster manner to help identify out of norms, right? To look at user behaviors, to try and understand if a particular user that's accessing the environment is out of the norm, which a human being is, for a human being, is close to impossible to do, right? Because again, there are multiple people accessing multiple resources within a day. So again, understanding who's accessing, at what pace, and even some of the cyber attackers, today, there is something called malware as a service, right? And many of my cyber peers would know this. You can literally buy bots today off the black market, off the dark web, to say, I want to launch an attack against company XYZ. No problem. That's easily bought, and it just doesn't cost a lot in any case. And they will keep trying. They'll keep trying until they get successful. The worst part for organizations like you and me is that we do not have, you see, the problem is we have to get it right all the time. They have to get it right once, and it destroys us, right? We have to get it right all the time. Unfortunately, that's reality, right? So again, coming back to the threats and understanding accesses, you don't want people to be accessing information and unnecessarily, right? So the identity solution for today, if I were to go on and talk about what's important, right? Again, I'm going to say, having identity assurance, governance, as well as having the ability to implement a zero trust model. And when I say enterprise-grade solution, what it means is really something that suits your business, right? If you are a manufacturing company, you will definitely have the on-prem as well as maybe some form of cloud services. The identity platform that you need to put in needs to be able to support both environments. It cannot just be one, right? Imagine if you had a house and you say, okay, I'm just going to lock the front gate. I'm not going to lock the main door. Does that do you any good? You're only protecting half of your house, right? That's essentially what it is, right? So you need to look at your environment. You need to look at the technologies that you have in place and implement what's best suited. The solution should help your problem and not you fit whatever product and cyber technology that you put in there, right? Okay, I know I'm a little bit out of time, so I'm going to go a little bit faster. So flexible arrangements, we know we have the users demanding more access because the work and the personal life balance is a bit haywire right now, right? People use their work computers to access social media platforms. We know that all happens. So the identity solution must be convenient, right? It cannot be intrusive. It cannot be a bother to them, right? So we talk about that convenience, okay? All right, so RSA Secure ID, we have been there for many years. And today, we have also moved on a cloud platform as well. Not necessarily a 100% cloud platform. Many of our customers still do have a hybrid approach. In fact, majority of our customers implement a hybrid approach simply because there's no way any organization do 100% cloud right now, right? Even if you are one of the newer technologies, right? So again, that's important. I shall not talk about all of these. So again, in summary, it's around empowering the flexibility as well as the convenience, right? And last slide, secure ID today. Multiple factors of authentication we provide. It's not just two-factor, one-factor, right? So multiple forms of authentication, access and single sign-on. I talked about the enterprise grade, be it whether it's a hybrid deployment, be it whether it's cloud or purely on-prem, so that's fine. Last but not least, I'd like to talk about this last point, and that is around the integrations. You see, the one major problem that a lot of organizations have is they will look at a particular, maybe good enough or a free solution that they have and put in as an identity solution, and then they realize that it does not support all the other solutions that they've implemented in the environment. That becomes a problem because you're going to spend more time trying to integrate that to your rest of the applications and trying to protect the rest of your applications. In fact, the cost of doing that outweighs whatever upfront cost that you're going to pay, right? So it's important that whatever identity platform that you adopt today has the ability to integrate with the multiple solutions that you have in your environment and not vice versa, right? You should not be implementing all your solutions around the identity solution. In fact, the identity solution should be implemented on top of whatever solutions that you have today and be able to integrate seamlessly with them, right? So that's all for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charles, for the insightful sharing.